Rabbi Tovia Singer joins us again here at Mythvision Podcast to talk about the New Testament, to talk about Christianity, and how much different it is from its Hebrew roots, if you will, the Hebrew Bible. Really, it's extremely different. We're going to go into sin, salvation, Israel, the nations, and foreign influence on Christianity. I hope you guys like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to comment your thoughts about this video. Stuff gets really juicy in here. I really appreciate all you guys who decided to become Patreon fans and join Mythvision. We are Mythvision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, the King of the Jews, Rabbi Tovia Singer. How are you, my friend?
Okay, I'm well, but your viewers, I need to explain that to your viewers of why you say that. That sounds a little insane. No. So I need to give the background.
Go ahead.
The viewers are going, what is that? So it's not that I'm competing with Jesus, because I-N-R-I. So that's not what this is. The way this started is that, like, the first time we spoke, I think, you asked me if I should address you as rabbi.
Yes.
And I responded, so this is like an inside joke. So I responded by saying, we can really dispense with all the titles and all these fancy things, and you can just call me King of the Jews. And it was, of course, apparently funny. So that became an opening line of why Derek says that, because that's how it all started.
It's a tease.
So that's a tease. But no one was privy to that. So they're going, why is he doing that?
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from. And I'll be doing that throughout the show. Everything that Derek says that you're going, why? I'll go, okay, let me explain. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, me and Rabbi we have a connection, obviously, so you guys don't take offense to it. I'm not comparing him to King Herod either, so so just make sure you understand that. I'm jokingly poking at this whole idea of, my thing is, Rabbi, I'm coming out of Christianity, and so my central focus on this channel is to discuss things pertinent to Christianity, and you know, I do think it's important that you get the background for which something like Christianity comes, if you will, is birthed from. And so a lot of people think how Jewish Christianity is, but I don't think many people realize how non-Jewish it is. So I figure in this show, let's talk about Paul, let's talk about Christianity, let's talk about how different it really is. And you mentioned this in previous shows, which I love, and you've mentioned not too long ago how Paul spiritualizes things that are in Deuteronomy and talking about the oxen and in 1 Corinthians 9. And you go to Hebrews and talk about the sacrifice. You mentioned, and I'm jumping around to give you ideas to kind of flow with from here. You mentioned human sacrifice is an abomination in the Old Testament. The only way that could slip through the cracks into a New Testament picture, in my opinion, is if there's major Greek or some type of non-Jewish influence going on in the New Testament. There's no way you can have a Hebrew-rooted, truly Hebrew system called Christianity and have a human at the central focus point as the sacrifice. So with that, let's jump off.
Yeah, well, just think about this for a moment. It's funny. I was speaking to a professor in Kenya, a really bright fellow, and I don't know where he is. He left Christianity, or he's considering leaving Christianity. He's quite a knowledgeable fellow, and he's a black guy. And I just said to him, I mean, think about this for a moment. In the Christian view, God is a white guy. God is not just a white guy. He's an amazing looking white guy. I mean, he looks, it's one of the striking things that when you see him, like in no movie is he a short, fat, bald guy with a big goiter coming out of his head, his face, and he's got a huge beer belly. he can't be that. He's got to be white. He's got to be Caucasian. He's got to have amazing, I should have hair like that. He has like not a split end, like perfect. And there was one video I was watching the other day. I've got to find this. The guy looked so good. He looked like he was like from a Macy's catalog or something. So what, it's so clear that what people did was they went, what is the best looking kind of guy possible? Like cheekbones, crazy, and that's what it is. And then another thing that's interesting is that when you see the images of Hercules, like what did Hercules look like? And when we say what did he look like, what we mean by that is the statues of Hercules, what does the face look like? It's the same thing as Jesus. So what Christianity has sought to do and done successfully is create God in his image. This became very striking to me when I moved to the Far East and lived in Indonesia and lectured in all over the Far East, from Thailand to Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, so these are Asians. But the Asians, their coloring books, and it doesn't make them into Catholic or Protestant, but they all have these coloring books or these. Jesus is never Asian. He's always white, and he's really tall. It's like if you ask any guy, what would you want to look like? That. I want to look like Jesus.
That's a funny point that you bring up, because I will say that I have seen a lot in America, by the way. There is, if you go to like flea markets or little stores and thrift shops, if there is an African American who's selling like Christian material, they might have a black Jesus, but he's still chiseled out. He might have like fro type hair, if you will, but he's still got the Grecian body style. Like he's got that build to him. But a lot of times they'll add the colors of the African flag into this. It's like, what kind of Jesus do you want?
Here's what I want to explain. What Christianity is an effort to create God in the image of a perfect man. And conversely, Judaism, the Torah, is about God creating man in his image. We have no idea what Abraham looked like, and it just would not be relevant. And Moses was not an articulate speaker. At the end of chapter 6 of Exodus, one of the arguments that Moses uses to avoid being the selected prophet, he was very humble, is he said, I'm an oral sephasai. He had a speech impediment. Elisha was bald. You'd never have a bald Jesus. So what I'm saying is that what it is that it's the perfect person, and the person that you could never be. And that's where this really does run theologically, because Jesus is perfect, sinless, he never did anything wrong, and you've done so many things wrong. Only he can then die for your sins, and only if you eat his body and drink his blood. That's the ritual cannibalism was pervasive in the ancient world. Then you can then attain the powers that Jesus had. That's very important. This is right in the Christian Bible, that when Jesus just breathed on his disciples, they were then able to do the things that Jesus did. In the book of Acts, which essentially is whoever Luke is, but Luke's version of how the church developed following the crucifixion, Peter, Paul, the followers of Jesus are then able to do the miracles that Jesus was doing during his lifetime. That's the idea. The idea is that they have received those gifts and now they can do all those things. But that's because you have... and here's the term that's so native to Paul, that Christ dwells in you. Is Christ in you? You go, well, what does that mean? That term, Christ in you, I don't know how many times it appears in the Christian Bible. Let's just say about 85 times or so. I'm probably off on that, but I'm not wildly off. It's about 80, 85. It's in that range. It's less than 100. But it's almost all in Paul's letters. It's almost never in the Gospels. Never. Well, what does that mean? Christ is in you. There is nothing like that in Tanakh. No, nothing. There's nothing. I mean, the reason why Jews don't believe in Jesus is not because we don't like Christians or Christianity. It's because it's so alien to anything found in Tanakh. Now, Christ dwells in you. What does that mean? Is Christ in you? Is Christ dwelling inside of you? What is that? So what that means is that if you eat the body and drink the blood, whether it's literally as Catholics and Eastern Orthodox believe, or whatever, figuratively, if you accept Christ in your life and he then dwells in you, it's the same thing. What happens is then you take on the powers and the gifts and the eternal life that was once in Christ, and Christ is in you. This is thoroughly pagan. It's unknown to the Jewish scriptures, and that's what I wanted to bring up. Hinduism is irrelevant to Judaism. It's just different than Judaism. But in fact, Christianity is opposed by the Jewish scriptures at every turn. One other caveat, if I may, Derek. Christianity would be, this is going to be a little counterintuitive for you watching the show. Christianity would be the easiest religion in the world to prove true. It would be so easy to prove it's true because all you would have to do is just show it in the Jewish scriptures and you're done. Christians will go about this just in the completely the wrong way. They're going, pick a card, I had a cold, I had a flu, it went away, there's a guy in Nigeria who resurrected. None of that is in the Jewish scriptures. All you have to do, and it would be just all you'd have to do is one thing, and that is show where the core doctrines of the church, for instance, the Eucharist, are found explicitly anywhere in Tanakh. And lest you think I'm cornering you in or making this difficult, the Jewish scriptures is enormous, a little less than 24,000 passages. I mean, the entire Christian Bible would fit into just the first four books of Moses. So the Jewish Bible is huge. You would have a huge selection to move from. Well, as it turns out, there's nothing there. The doctrine of the Trinity. There is nothing that states that there is one God in three persons. Don't tell me about God's name as a plurality. The doctrine of the Trinity. You don't have to use the same words, Trinity. I got that. It's a different word. I concede all that. Just say that there's one God in three, blah, whatever word you want to put in there, and these three are one. None of that's there. It's not even in the Christian Bible. So that's all you'd have to do. And it's also conversely, it's the easiest religion to disprove because it so contradicts the core tenets that are articulated by the prophets of blessed memory. In fact, reading the Jewish scriptures, it becomes very clear that the prophets of Israel were really thinking about Christianity that was coming down the pike and forewarning every aspect of it. They were arguing against Christianity, which would not emerge. Isaiah lived 700 years before the advent of the Christian religion, Zechariah 500. Joshua, much longer than that. But all these prophets are all opposing Christian teachings long before anyone would identify as a Christian.
Would it be fair to nail that down here, that these prophets, all right, and just getting the building blocks of Christianity, because from what I understand when I'm researching the development of Christianity, is the foreign influence on, say, Jewish sects that start to take place, especially like in Rome and Greece and so forth. Their influence, their Platonic philosophy, their pagan ideas, all this stuff started to influence, and only certain sects of Jews, and they were probably very Hellenized, of course, started to run with these ideas. And the prophets are saying, don't do this, don't follow after that. There's going to come a time where you guys are going to follow after these ideas, and that is what they're talking about.
Yes,
so technically, the building blocks of Christianity come from the foreign, and is saying, don't follow these when you see these things, run from it.
I want to develop that. That's exactly correct. So a person could flippantly say that when did the Gnostic religious movement begin? There were many varieties of it. One, which is most famous, is Gnostic Christians. We know a lot about them because their opponents, the writings of their opponents, church fathers, survived. But when did that develop? So people would ordinarily say, well, Gnosticism, which is this dualistic thinking that man was on this materialistic world, that essentially we had to get off of it, and we had to have certain knowledge, hence gnosis, to get off of it. So people would normally say it was first, second century. But that's very misleading. The ideas ensconced in Gnosticism are all over Greek thinking, the ideas and Zoroastrian thinking. So therefore, it's not like this came out of nowhere. This type of thinking would have emerged from the world that was in, as you said, from the Greco-Roman world. And I would posit that the Greeks didn't invent things, but refine things. They took religious ideas and views that were widely held in the East, in Egypt, in Persia, and developed them and refined them into what we know now. You refer to the Neoplatonic ideas, but it's not like they were just pulling stuff out of somewhere that was unknown. We could see the antecedents for these ideas. And then, of course, Rome did not convert to Christianity. Christianity conversely converted to Rome. It adopted these ideas. So much so, one other caveat, Justin, a really early church father, that means he's first half of the second century. Justin, in his defense of Christianity, makes the point, and he's speaking not to Jews here, but he's speaking to pagans. He makes the point, because the pagans who are the Romans, they would mock Christianity, and there was really early church fathers had to deal with pagan opponents of Christianity. Origen did, and one of his books like that survived. And one of the points that Justin makes is, why are you so hostile to the teachings of the church and the miracles that Jesus did? All the religions you believe in have very similar ideas. And so even though he's doing that as an apologetic, in fact, he's giving it away. He's quite right. These ideas were very well developed in the world of the Greco-Roman world, and therefore would make the transition from pagan. When we use the word pagan, pagans, to the point, would never have called themselves pagans. Pagan is just a Greek term which means someone who lived outside the city in the suburbs, meaning they were not in the center, so eventually that word became conventional. So the pagans would have a very easy slide right into Christianity. You have the Mother of God, you have all the stuff that you'd find in Carthage, all of it. It's not an accident that Tertullian, Latin church father, second half of the second century, very early third century, he would coin the term Trinity. He was in a very important place of the empire, where if you wanted to speak to people, you had to speak to people in terms of gods, but in three persons, in the Trinity, and that's his coined phrase.
Interesting. So, okay, I was thinking of something before we get to my question of sin and salvation and the differences between what sin and salvation is from what the Hebrew scriptures teach it and from what the New Testament, which is a radically new and different idea. Just something popped in my head, the whole idea that the Romans had ancestral worship, and I don't know if it plays a role, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did a spin there of some type of ancestral type worship on this guy, Jesus, because they worshiped him. It's not like they worshiped, Yahweh or something that, you're not able to see as an actual man. Here you have a man god, which is very pagan, of course. It's, he's demigod. But I don't know if ancestry worship plays a role into that.
So I discussed this quite a bit in Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. So they were worshiping, let me just talk about ancestor worship in the Greco-Roman world was not so much like in the Far East. In the Far East, even to this day in China, even though there's a lot of religious people in China, but it's largely a godless country, people really worship and do all sorts of rituals about their own grandparents and great-grandparents out of enormous reverence for their family. That's very, very Chinese. I want to go back west to the Roman Empire. There were just tiers and tiers of gods. They were what's called henotheistic. It pays to take 30 seconds and just explain this point. They believed that there was one great power as Hinduism, but they believed that there were lower level deities. Zeus or Jupiter couldn't possibly be bothered with your prayers and personal needs and that your cow wasn't giving milk. He couldn't be bothered with that because he was too busy running the planets and getting ladies pregnant. So now at the lowest tier of these gods was the man god, as you referenced. And those were people who were just too great to be just human. It's interesting that this kind of talk, just semantically, not ontologically, has crept its way into our own American talk. For instance, we might talk about in music, we might say the gods of rock and roll, right? So people might say, Jimmy Page and David Gilmour, these are like, now we Americans don't mean it that way. I don't know what they do in Britain, but they don't mean that. It means that people are just so superb at what they do that it's just not human. People refer to athletes, great athletes. These are the gods of baseball and so on, or being godlike. Now, that's how we talk today. But in the ancient world, they really thought that way. They really thought that Pythagoras was a great thinker, philosopher, mathematician. He had to be divine and human, and of course, born to a virgin. Hercules, his mother wasn't a virgin, but Zeus didn't mind impregnating her while her husband was away. I'm not kidding. And I'm not kidding. This is really the story. Zeus came and he dressed up like her husband, got her pregnant. Her husband came home from the army the next day. That sounds like that's the god. The emperors of Rome, Julius Caesar, of course, born of a virgin. Alexander the Great, of course, born of a virgin. These are all god men. Caesar Augustus, Octavius, they were divine and human. Now, the bad guys, Nero or those type of people were not considered gods because they were considered bad emperors. Caligula, bad emperor, but Vespasian. So that's their thing. To the Greek world, they were just great, great people who just did amazing things, like founded Rome, Romulus. There's no way they, first of all, could have been emerged from a sexual union, because to them, sexuality was this world. It's not that they didn't enjoy sex, but they thought it was a lower level, and therefore, if you were a supreme being, it means that you had to be born without any sexual activity.
If I may, I think that's an interesting point, just going to Abraham and Sarah, how God, literally a miracle happens in the narrative, and it's amazing because it didn't say, oh, Sarah, you're impregnated because here, I put the spirit in you, and she laughed, oh, we'll call him Isaac. No, she was now by sexual, through Abraham, he was able to impregnate her, whereas she wasn't able to do that before. And in Jesus,
Well, the Torah says that explicitly. The Torah, the Torah says explicitly that Sarah was an akara. She was barren. That's how we're introduced to her in Genesis chapter 11. I want to do this. I think your listeners would have a lot of fun with this. I want to take you to Exodus. I want to take you to the conception of Moses, like the greatest prophet. And let's see if we can. I never did this with anyone, but I'll do this now. Go to Exodus chapter 2, verse 1.
the king of the Jews is actually willing to take me here. This is awesome. Exodus chapter 2.
Yeah, verse 1. Here's our birth narrative. Let's see how this is our birth narrative of Moses. Vayelech ish mi beis Levi, and a man from the house of Levi went, vayikach es bas Levi, and he took a woman from the house of Levi, meaning he slept with her. There's your infancy narrative. What could be more plain than that? Do you see how absent of mythology there is in Moses' conception? The Torah wants to convey that a man who was from the tribe of Levi took a woman from the tribe of Levi, and they had a child, and it's Moses. Bingo, there's your birth. Contrast that, lahavdil, with Matthew 1 and 2, or, the opening of Luke. Luke has a huge infancy narrative that extends for 3 chapters. It's just, that's the difference. That's why, Derek, no one would ever think of worshiping Abraham. No matter how nuts you are, how crazy you are, I don't think there's a religion that has ever existed, I'm saying this without researching it, that ever had Abraham as a deity. It just never happened. I'm saying that extemporaneously without looking at. No one worships Moses. I don't know of anyone that ever did. No one ever worshipped Isaac in history. There's no record of that. Again, I'm saying that without looking up. I'm pretty sure I'm right. Because when you read Tanakh, it just would never occur to you to just worship any prophet. It would always, what it would do is just move your eyes to heaven and turn to God. Conversely, I would posit, when reading the Christian Bible, even though we don't have the full-blown doctrine of the Trinity, we could see the trajectory. And when you read the Christian Bible, you're right away looking to Jesus. And the idea of worshiping Jesus would immediately occur to you, because we see Jesus worshipped in the Christian Bible. Now, a warning, the Greek word for worship, prosekuneo, is an odd word, which could mean worship as in deity, or could mean just to serve someone out of great respect. But it's very easy to see how in the New Testament Jesus is the Son of God, not in Exodus 4:22, Deuteronomy 14:1 way, but really in a Greek sense.
If you want to really nail that coffin shut, he wouldn't have been forgiving sins if he wasn't on the level, or they were trying to put him on a level. Is there a place? That's a good question. Did Abraham and Moses, were they forgiving sins, or was it Yahweh that was forgiving?
No, but this is a misunderstanding, and I'm really glad you asked this question. So actually in the Christian Bible, Jesus doesn't say, I forgive your sin, because everybody thinks he does, and then they use that as an apologetic to say, well, only God could forgive sin, and therefore Jesus claimed to be God. It's a real inference. It's a little bit of a circus act. But if you look at the language in the Gospels, Jesus is saying in the Gospels, your sins are forgiven. In the passive, not that I am the one who forgives your sin. And as it turns out, that language is all over the Jewish scriptures, where someone, namely, let's just say a priest in Leviticus chapter 5, will say to the person who confesses their sin, your sin is now forgiven. So they're not saying that I forgive your sins, but rather God is forgiving that, and I'm just conveying that to you. And that's really what you find in the Gospels, because the Gospels isn't to the level of the Council of Nicaea yet. Isn't to the level. It's not there, but you could see where this thing is going. I mean, when you look at the gospel, you say, okay, it's not a surprise that people are going to be worshiping Jesus as full-blown God. Really early, Ignatius, he was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but he was, so he couldn't explain Ignatius is a really early church father. But you could see, okay, this is going really bad, and this is going to wind up where people are going to just full-blown worship Jesus. So therefore, Jesus actually is saying your sins are forgiven, and that is very much found in the Jewish Bible, where someone of great import is observing and saying, okay, your sins have been forgiven. So that could work. That's what you have.
Yeah, I follow you. And I think that the pagan influence is what really tilts the boat and lets the evolution of thought develop further. Especially, I was reading Dennis R. MacDonald's book recently, The Homeric Epics and the Gospels, and he literally shows there a lot of copying from the Odyssey into the Gospels in such a way that Jesus himself literally performs the miraculous claims of the gods. So like calming the storm, Odysseus was crying out to the gods to calm the storm during the storm in his story. However, Jesus literally does a more merciful act than the gods in the story of Odysseus by calming the storm with the disciples. So it's like there's this pagan layer that allows that development to take place very easily, and why I think Christianity went the way that it did, way more than it staying Jewish or trying to like evolve and become more Jewish in nature. No, they opened the door and there was no closing it once it was open. That's my opinion.
Oh yeah, and you could see the trajectory in the gospel. If we just use the gospel and we pull out of this for a moment, Mark, Jesus is presented to us as least divine. In Mark, Jesus is informed that by the heavenly voice. If you look at Mark 1:11, the heavenly voice at Jesus' baptism is, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So Jesus is being told in the second person, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." People might not think this is important. This is very important. So Mark is written about 70. Let's move 15 years to the book of Matthew. So this is the forensics. And we're going to go to Matthew 3:17. And there, just compare it. We have there the heavenly voice, but it's not "you are my beloved Son," but "this is my beloved Son." Now, you might think, well, just a pronoun. Forget that this is a contradiction. If you think about that these are contradictory, you're missing the whole point. They are contradictory, but it's really not very significant. But what is extremely important is Jesus finds out and is told that he is the Son of God when he's baptized. That's called an adoptionist theology. In Matthew, Jesus knows he's the Son of God. He was born of a virgin, after all. And the same thing in Luke. So therefore, the voice is not informing Jesus, "You are my beloved Son," but rather this. That's third person. So who is the voice talking to everybody else around there who doesn't yet know? I want you to know, this is my beloved Son. He knows already. That's why people get caught up in these contradictions, and they're very striking and they're interesting. But you have to do the forensics and go, well, why are they contradictory? Why are they telling a different story? It's not that someone made a mistake. It's a different theology, because in Matthew and Luke, Jesus becomes the Son of God quite literally at his conception, not at his baptism, whereas Mark, it's at the baptism. So we could trace that. And then we can go to John and find out, first of all, what's not in John. Think about this. What's not in John is his virgin birth. Bethlehem, not interested in that. In fact, in John 7, we have a very interesting, very weird little piece that bumps out where people go, how could Jesus be the Messiah? He's not from Bethlehem. And John, whoever wrote this book, doesn't even attempt to respond to it, leaves that answer and goes, and just doesn't go. But he was born in Bethlehem. So John is the only gospel author who never mentions the mother of Jesus by name. Never. He's just called the mother of Jesus. He wants to deliberately diminish her importance. Why? Because Jesus, in John's view, this is very late, maybe 95, Jesus is now from the eternal past. He's of the Logos. He's the Word of God. So he emerges somewhere in the eternal past. He's not the same as the Father, but wow, he becomes the Son of God long before he actually becomes carnate. So therefore, John wants to deliberately minimize the importance of his mother. She's not really important anymore. She's very important to Luke. Think about it. Think about how important Mary is, the mother of Jesus, in the book of Luke. I mean, she's the one having the conversation with Gabriel. It's not Joseph, as in Matthew. In the book of Matthew, Joseph is getting all the revelations that his wife the woman you betrothed is with a child and she'll bear a son. Don't put her away because Joseph gets the revelations in Matthew. Not Luke. That's why people think it is widely assumed that Matthew is a little bit, is from, let's say, 80 and Luke maybe 85. It's not everybody, but it's just generally consensus. But the reason is that Luke is focusing in on Mary, the Annunciation. It's Mary, the person who has this amazing family, Elizabeth, Zachariah. It's only found in Luke. And that they're blameless. That's how we're introduced to everybody in Luke is Zachariah and Elizabeth. In verse 6 of chapter 1 of Luke, it says that explicitly that Luke and Zachariah never sinned. Never sinned. Which from Paul's view, that's impossible. Everybody sins. You understand how crazy that is? So many... No, so right. So they're all coming from different views. So that's why we have these. And Luke doesn't care about Paul's, even though whoever wrote Luke is promoting Paul, he is definitely not going to toss his great story about Zachariah and Elizabeth being sinless, because if Mary comes from such an amazing family, she has, cousins who are sinless, that elevates Mary. Romans 3. Forget Romans 3. We're going with this story. I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm trying to show you how that you need to just do this forensics. The problem here is very simple for Christians or people who come from the Christian world. You read Matthew, and then you go to Mark, and it kind of looks the same. And Luke kind of looks the same. Maybe not in the same order. Maybe there's some, but it just looks very similar. And it just all gets blurred. It's pretty obvious that John is different, but it's the same, basically the same thing, just Jesus does a lot of talking. In John, he has huge dialogues, but so it's just a blur. And unless you just go, okay, let's first read the Christian Bible in its chronological order, start with Mark. It's a really short book, 678 passages, not even 2 hours to read it carefully. Then you go to Matthew, go, whoa, okay, I see this is really quite different. But there's a reason. It's not, it's sophomoric. To just say, they're just contradicting. It's only meaningful, right, there's a reason why they're different. And as you said, Derek, it's because they're really telling different stories. It's a different Christology.
They're competing. Let me shift topics. I got a really good question because I don't want to run out of time here. This is important. Most people just take this for granted based on what we've been taught and told. Even if you're not a Christian, even if you're not a religious person, everyone has this idea that we've been told that everybody sins. There's a moral code, and everybody in some way, shape, or form has sinned. And there are people who suggest that the only people who actually sinned were those who were given the law, and therefore no one outside of the 12 tribes in the world sinned. Now, I'd like to ask you, maybe develop the idea, and I guess asking a very basic question that is very simple. In Jewish thought, when Adam sinned, when he disobeyed God and he fell, he died. Now, was that death, or was the consequence of his disobedience physical death? And is this why the Jews have a future physical resurrection concept?
All right. Wow. This is why I enjoy doing the show with you. So that is so pregnant with so many different points. So just really quickly, it doesn't mean that Adam died that day, although that's the language. It means that death now became possible, meaning death entered the world. People die. Adam would live for 930 years after that event. But I want to walk this back. So I want to. So prior to the giving of the Torah, there were commandments. We see them in the Torah, and people don't get this. I mean, if there were no commandments, why was there a flood? What did they do wrong if nobody told them anything? And in fact, when God is negotiating with Abraham in Genesis 18, at the end of 18, the last part of 18, and God is saying that Sodom has to be destroyed because they're wicked, and Abraham asked God, but there might be 50 righteous people. What does that mean? That means what would they have done righteous if there was no Torah? So this is a huge mistake. There were we call Noahide laws. Don't worry about the word. Adam was our first prophet, and that would continue until 2,500 years ago, until Malachi, the last prophets. We always had prophecy. And during that time, people very much knew what to do. We're told in Genesis 9 not to eat the flesh of an animal whose blood is in it. They're there. So there are commandments that are prior to the giving of the Torah. But I want to ignore that because I want to focus on one thing. I want to convey that Christianity rightfully, as is Judaism, is consumed with sin and what to do with it. Okay? This is very important. Christianity and Judaism, understandably, would be very, very concerned with sin. The problem with Christianity is not that it's concerned with sin. The problem is that the antidote that Christianity gives is the motherlode of bad ideas. It would be the equivalent of somebody saying, you really shouldn't smoke. Here, why don't you do heroin? Well, heroin is infinitely worse than smoking cigarettes. What are you doing? Why don't smoke cigarettes? Here, smoke crack. What Christianity does is its solution is a nightmare, because its solution is ritual cannibalism. Its solution is to worship a man as God. Its solution is spiritual adultery. If you are a Christian, I've just offended you. I don't want to, but we may not be far away from the final redemption. If I don't speak up, you're going to ask me, Rabbi, why didn't you say anything? You need to hear this.
Well, Rabbi, if you don't mind me mentioning something on what you just said that's important, is you mentioned this on the previous video, not recently, where you said Christians and the Jewish people agree on a presupposition. You both have to agree on the Old Testament, or as Christians call
Absolutely.
it. And so, when you get to the new and it does change, there are things that obviously are not the same. There's a big red flag. But I wanted to ask you if we can zero in on something that's important to me, even though it's taken for granted. And I think spelling it out as someone who's studied like you are can explain this and give evidence for. Could people who were not descendants of Abraham, or let's scratch the Noahide law idea. Let's scratch that. One question, I guess yes or no, if you can answer yes or no, and then kind of asking something bigger here. Was Adam, according to Tanakh, was Adam the first man? And then number two, before we get into that, okay, so simple, perfect. Okay, now, if he's the first man, here's an important question. I've had people recently tell me no one could sin that was not given the law. And that to me flew in the face of, why is God judging other nations?
That's true. That is true. Therefore, Adam received the law, not the law given at Mount Sinai. I want to illustrate this because a lot of people, you are watching the show. I'm not talking to you, Derek, but you, the viewer, watching the show, and you may have been a Christian at some time. It's very possible. So I want to just demonstrate this to you, okay? So it's very clear, for example, that murder is a sin. We see that in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel. It's just abundantly clear that, or else Cain didn't do anything wrong. Genesis 6, robbery, rape, flood. This is completely axiomatic that people knew about sin before. Well, could you repeat your question? Maybe edit this out.
Yeah, because I want to narrow it down to something important.
What did you just ask for a moment?
My point is, can non-Israelites, let's scratch the Israelite because I know that comes later, okay? The idea of Israel comes later. Can people who are not God's covenant people, let's put it like that, can they sin?
Yes, of course. Therefore, they can and they did. And Noah was not Jewish. Noah was a righteous person. We are told that straight in the Torah. Well, how was Noah righteous if there was no Torah before? It even gets a little interesting because Noah, when he's told to put the animals on the ark, he's told to put the clean animals, 7 of them, so he was aware of these. He's aware of these laws. Every person is created in the image of God, and every person who is loyal to Hashem has a place in the world to come. The reason why people don't buy this in the West is, and people really think this, is because even though they quit Christianity, they still, the smell of tobacco is all over their clothing. Although they quit smoking, it's still, the odor is there. The Christian Bible characterizes Jews and Judaism as exclusive, and salvation is only for the Jews. And this idea has polluted the minds of Christians. I want to just show you this explicitly. I mean, where Peter won't sit with Christians, but Jesus literally, we are told in the Gospels, won't even heal a non-Jewish woman's daughter who is vexed with the devil. And he says explicitly it is not right to give the children's bread to dogs. And only when she comes up with a interesting response, but even dogs eat from the crumbs that fall from the master's table, does he heal the daughter. So in the Christian Bible, and this is why Christians think this, they believe that we're elitists. They believe, and correctly so, meaning from the way the New Testament portrays the Jews and Judaism, they correctly infer that Jews must feel that salvation is only available to them. Matthew chapter 10, don't even go into the cities of the Gentiles and the Samaritans. Only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Don't even go to the low-down goyim who are a bunch of dogs. If you think I'm making this up, that means you're not familiar with the Christian Bible. And if you are, you know I'm not making any of this up. So what ex-Christians think, and certainly Christians do, is that we think we are exclusive. This is so wrong. We are unique in that we have a role to be a light to the nations. Our job is to be a Or Lagoyim, Isaiah 42, verse 6, Isaiah 49, verse 6. We are to be priests of the world, Exodus 19, 5 and 6. So therefore the role of the Jew is to raise up all the other nations. But because of the characterization of the Jew as conveyed in the New Testament, people really think that the way Peter is characterized in Acts, that he wouldn't sit with non-Jews and so, none of this is true. And Jews read this, not a lot of Jews read the Christian Bible, but those who do go, whoa, that's really weird. We don't think that stuff at all. Our job really is to bring the world to the knowledge of one true God. And I've heard many. It's so important. I've heard Christians think this and Muslims say this. I would kind of believe in Judaism, but Judaism is only for Jews. And every time I hear it, it's like someone just kicked me in the stomach. I go, God.
You bring up something that is so important with my recent, research here that I think is very important and would love to delve into in further shows with more. I guess I'll have the questions particularly written so that you can answer them. But I totally agree. From my perception, when I read Tanakh, it appears that God has chosen a certain people. And yes, there is a distinct lineage. There is a seed there. There is a particular line of people. However, when I do read, there were people who were attached to these people that were not genetic descendants, that were not.
I want to play a little further. I just want to play with. I want to parse this out.
Okay.
Because people could be misunderstand. The Jewish people have a unique covenant with God, and our role in the world is to bring the knowledge of God to all of God's younger children, other children. If you think that I just use some wooey language to sound like I have a guitar in Sedona, Arizona with incense flying, I'm not. This is the language of the Torah. When Moses stands before Pharaoh, he refers to the children of Israel as God's firstborn son. Well, if we're God's firstborn son, who are the other children of God, the non-Jews? Those who are not the B'nai Israel. Our job is to lift up the world. That's the role of the Jew. It can be said, therefore, easily, that the role of the Jew is really a facilitator for non-Jews. That means we're here in a strange way for the non-Jews. We're here for you. We're here to raise you up and to bring you into a knowledge of the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how all reverse this is. Now, one other point. In order for a nation to have the ability to raise up the world, now, most Jews don't do this. Bernie Madoff, whatever, but it's not referring to him and Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky and Sam Harris. It doesn't mean these people. It just means those who are loyal to God, those who are the righteous remnant, characterized in Zephaniah 3, verse 12 through 16. In order to do that, the nation of Israel requires special commandments. So I want to illustrate this to you in a black and white way that you can see this very clearly. We are introduced to the Sabbath right from the get-go, Genesis chapter 2. That's how it opens. That God completed the sixth day. It was finished. It was evening, morning. And then we immediately, the seventh day, God set it aside and made it holy. That's Genesis chapter 2. What we don't have there is any mention of observing any commandments on this holy day. So Shabbos, the seventh day, God rests. Now, why would God need to rest? Was he tired, needed a vacation? Why did we celebrate him doing nothing? That's a whole different question. It's a brilliant question, but we're not going to go there now. What is evident here is that God sanctified this seventh day, made it holy, but there's nothing about keeping any commandments. It is only once a nation is forged, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the book of Exodus, then we have our commandments. And then we have the Ten Commandments given to the Jews that they have to keep Shabbos, Exodus 31 as well. It's all over the place. So it is true that in order for the children of Israel to carry out their mandate, they have to be using jet fuel. They need to be having special commandments that would enable them to bring this light to the world. Most Jews failed at this task. That's evident from our own record. But there's always a loyal remnant, it's described in many places, who are faithful to Hashem, and these are the ones who can bring the knowledge of God to the world. And that's why Zechariah 8:23 tells us that it's a messianic passage, that when Mashiach comes, 10 people of all the nations will grab the shirt of a Jew and say, "Take us with you. Now we know that God is with you." It's a beautiful, perfect circle at the end.
I was going to say on the whole salvation, this goes right to the heart of what I'm finding in differences too is resurrection from the dead. There's the salvation from that first initial death that is going to come upon all men, and that is the promise, if you will, that everyone is going to either be resurrected in this, and is that the self?
Let me have a shot at this. So it's very interesting. I want you, the viewer, listen very carefully. So it's very interesting. The resurrection of the dead is in Tanakh. It's in the Jewish scriptures, and it's in the Christian Bible. It's a lot in the Christian Bible. It's very rarely discussed in Tanakh. And what it is, it's not a threat. It's just passingly mentioning it. But it is the resurrection of the dead in the New Testament is the threat. Eternal damnation is the threat. And it's a very successful threat. It really scares people to death. No pun intended, because people really are horrified by the fact that there's death. And like, what happens after you die? It's frightening. And when you tell people that if you listen to me, you're going to go to heaven, and if you don't do what I say, you're going to go to hell, that really works. It's a very successful threat, and it's a very successful payoff. And it's found in the Christian Bible explicitly as a threat. I don't mean that it's a pejorative. It's just there as a threat. It's never in Tanakh as a threat. There are a lot of threats in the Jewish Bible. That's just not one of them. Now, the reason why it's in the Christian Bible is because you can't check it out. It's unverifiable. And in Tanakh, it's never used because God authored Tanakh. He moved the prophet's hands. He doesn't need to. So I want to do this with you as a final piece together. I want to play the game of if you were God, okay? If just so for you, if you were God and you are in speaking to the world and you want to convince them to live a certain way, that this is good, this is not good, and I'm going to show you what's good and bad, and sometimes I might punish you. If you were God, what would the threat sound like? And if you're not God and you're just making this up, what would you threaten? So, if go ahead.
I can only speak from what I understand in my brain and how I am, but I would say this would be my way if I was a father-type figure and I wanted my creation to obey me. I would not threaten them with a punishment of eternal damnation or an idea of when you die, that's
Why not?
it.
Why not?
Well, first of all, because I care for my creation, number one. And number two, in my opinion, and this just being a father of 3 children, but number two, I would let their own mistakes teach them of their lessons so that they could kind of like, I guess, if you do this,
I want to push back on this. Okay. So I want to say that I want to threaten, I would want to show them the consequences of what they're doing is spiritually so dangerous. Like, for instance, people smoke cigarettes. So initially they feel fine, but eventually they start coughing, hacking. They can't walk up a flight of stairs. And so there are really things going on that's sending a message to the smoker, you're dying inside. Mm-hmm. And that's really good because people then quit because they can sense that there's something really bad going on. So let me submit the following. If you were God, you would say to somebody, look, if you're going to sin, here's what's going to happen. It's going to stop raining. It's going to stop raining because you're God. You really not only could forecast the weather as on CNN, but you can actually make the weather do whatever you want it to do. If you're God, you could say that you're going to be exiled to the land 70 years. But you're going to be exiled, so you know. That means, and then you'll know to repent, because if it doesn't rain and I can control the rain, that means if we're God and we want to get the message out, we love you, but when you mess up, we're going to do things that are very tangible, that you'll know. We're not going to say something is going to happen to you after you die, because it's too late. If you are God, you would instruct your prophets to say, it's going to stop raining. The earth, the land will not give forth its fruit. And that's going to be a wake-up call to repent, to turn back to me. I know, yeah, right. You're not going to have children. Your wife, your cow won't give milk. That means if you're God, we can really do that. I can do that if I'm God. You can do that if you're God. If you're not God, would you ever threaten that it's going to stop raining? No. Why? Because you can't make it stop raining. You're just faking it. If you're not God and just writing this stuff, you can't stop my wife from getting pregnant. You can't make her have babies. You don't have any of those controls. So what would you then do if you're not God? Is you would just be front-loading the threat with going to heaven and going to hell. Because they have no idea if that means you're my assistant. I'm Moses, they have no idea what's going to really happen after you die. So there is a heaven and there is a hell. And Hitler is in hell. And so is bin Laden. These people really, there is a hell for such evil people. And there is a resurrection of the dead. And the reason why the resurrection of the dead is the last stage of life is not because what most people think, that death is a really bad thing because in the middle of the party, you get tapped on the shoulder and told that you have to leave the party, and worse, the party goes on without you. But if you're really good, you get to go back to the party. And I think that's how people process the resurrection of the dead, is you get to come back, even though you had to leave, but you get to come back. And that's a huge relief. But that's in fact not occurring. What happens is that our physical body is animal, our spiritual soul is from above. If we are successful in life into infusing the holy into our physical body, the body then became the vessel for which our service to God has become permeated. And therefore the physical body is holy and it then must return back to life. We made the physical into something spiritual by living our lives in a certain way. It is the natural result of a spiritual life. So therefore, whenever you see a lot of, you're going to go to hell, heaven, Mark 16, well, it's all over the place. That should make you very suspicious. That is not to say that there isn't heaven and hell. There really is. And it is really a bad thing to go around killing people because you're going to go to hell. There really is a place for Eichmann, and he's there, and he has a lot of very interesting roommates. Those people really, there is a punishment for those who are very, very wicked. It's in Tanakh, but the Tanakh doesn't threaten it. It will mention the resurrection of the dead. Daniel 12:2. Isaiah 26:19, and so on. But it's not. There's no threat. So then, again, I want to. There's a little. This is so big, but it's a little nuanced. If you were God, you would, and you really can control what goes on in the world, you would never be threatening heaven and hell. You would be saying, look, I want to just key you off. You're going really in the bad direction, that something's going to happen, and I can control that because I created it all. And that's what we find in the Tanakh, that God, the prophet saying, well, this is exactly what's going to happen to you, and only God can control that. If you're not God, you would just overload it. And if you ask Christians, please, if you're a Christian, don't think personally, Christians will say to people who used to be Christians, or why aren't you Christians? Is because I don't want to go to hell. Number one is, don't you want to go to heaven? I want to be saved. So that's why when you ask me salvation, Judaism, Christianity, for Christianity, believing in Jesus is your ticket to resurrection. It means you get to go to the concert. If people stop, you get to see, the Led Zeppelin reunion. You get free front row tickets to the best concert in the world. You get to come back. Now, it's true there is a resurrection, but the point is, why would you do that when you can do other things like make the ground give forth food and make it rain a lot so that it can, and sun? You're God. You could do that. You don't need to do the weird stuff. So that's what I want to convey. There is a heaven, there is a hell, but Tanakh doesn't threaten it because it's by God, and God doesn't need that. He could return the Jews back to their land, and he did it. He did it, and out of the ashes of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, the Jews returned back to their land. A miracle. God kept his promise. And that's who we believe in. Listen to these words. We'll close with this. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 29. V'gam netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, the glory of Israel does not lie. Ki lo yadamu, because he's not a man, lehinachem, he's not going to change his mind. The reason we know that the God of Israel is true is because he keeps his promise. Whatever he said, I might not understand all of it. Are there mysteries? Oh, yes. We have a finite mind. God has an infinite mind. Although we have the same values, God is seeing the larger picture. But we can trust in the God of Israel because we go, wow, he really kept his promise. But I don't understand that passage in Joshua. But he kept his promise, so I'm going to trust in him. Are there mysteries? Of course there are. But there can't be contradiction in the true faith, the faith of Israel. The last passage of Deuteronomy 29. We were talking about 30, now we're just rolling it back. Deuteronomy 29, last verse. Of course there are secrets, there are mysteries that are very difficult for us to explain. The secret things belong to the Lord, but that which has been revealed belongs to us and our children, that we may keep all the words of this Torah. So, Derek, thank you so much for having me on. I hope this is like really deep. What we're doing here is not just running the surface. But what I want to do is unpack it. I want to just let's look at the wiring, what's really going on here, so people can understand about God, the God of Israel, the creator of the heavens and earth. Also a message to the viewers, to some of you who are suffering out there with this terrible plague that is going on now, this virus that has seized the world. If you are suffering from this, I wish you a refuah shlema, a complete recovery. If you aren't suffering from this, stay inside. Please be very, very careful, and pray to Hashem that we will see the other side of this. Why is this? It's a long conversation, but please, for those of you who are suffering, my prayers are with you, and you should have a complete recovery.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Rabbi Tovia Singer for joining us today. Rabbi, thank you so much. You've written some books. You have a website people can go to, and actually you're reachable. So I myself was capable of getting a hold of you and trying to contact. So if you guys have any questions that you guys have for Rabbi Tovia Singer, let me know, so that the next show we do, we can go ahead and ask those questions. Particularly, I'll even mention you by name if you want. And we'll have Rabbi talk about them. Thank you so much for these words and making sense of the differences and really what came first. And I really do appreciate this. I learned a lot from the show.
Shalom.
Adon olam asher malach b'terem kol yetzi